Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Before I start, let me note that yesterday something very major happened, potentially for the world of counterterrorism, and that was the vote of the Turkish public to endorse constitutional changes by a resounding 58 to 42%, which is a significant step on the road that Turkey is taking from being a Western state to being an Islamist state. And if it's an Islamist state, it will have implications for counterterrorism. So I think it's a very significant long-term development. My title today is Terrorism Without Islamism. And what I mean by that is to raise the question, how come, time and again, either when dealing with specific incidents or dealing with a general issue, politicians, law enforcement, media, academics, and others refuse to acknowledge what is so obvious, that this is something to do with Islam. Over and over again, they avoid this topic. And so my question is, why and what might change it? And as an illustration, let me conjure up an event from 10 months ago when an American Army major by the name of Nidal Malik Hassan went on a rampage and killed 14 people. His Islamist outlook was perfectly clear by virtue of his speech, his actions, and his dress. And yet, in the press reports that followed, his motives were ascribed to having been the victim of racism and harassment, a sense of not belonging, pre-traumatic stress disorder, whatever that may be, mental problems, emotional problems. There was an official U.S. military report that went into great depth about this atrocity, and only in citing one book that had to do with Islam did the word Islam or Muslim ever appear. In other words, nothing about it came out in the press or the official reports. So this is one incident of a larger pattern in which the establishment denies, the establishment being politicians, law enforcement, academics, and the press, the motive of Islamism when it comes to terrorism. And I think this is very important because on the one hand it obstructs effective counterterrorism, and by implication it makes terrorism more likely. So this is something very important. What I shall do in the next few minutes is four things. Document this denial, document some exceptions to it, try and explain it, and then offer some recommendations with an emphasis on trying to explain it. Now, as a factual base, let me explain what I mean by Islamism. It is a form of Islam that seeks to make Muslims strong through rigid application of the Islamic law, the Sharia. It reverts to medieval norms in its aspirations to create a caliphate that rules the entire globe. Let me also document what I mean by Islamist terrorism. There is a website called thereligionofpeace.com that has documented since 9/11 the attacks by Islamists. Now, of course, it's imperfect, but it does give a good sense internationally of how many they've been, and its count is 16,000 plus, which translates to 5 a day or so. That's a lot of attacks. There's no other source of terrorism that's remotely as large a number or as deadly as this source. Now, in terms of documenting denial, I'd like to look at two levels. First, specific incidents, and then the general problem. Willfully and consistently, the authorities point to things that have nothing to do with Islamism. I won't cite the details of these specific examples, but I can offer them to you if you wish them. But here are a range of discussions. The first one is 1990, the assassination of Rabbi Meir Kahane in New York. The mayor said it was a prescription drug for depression that got the assassin of Kahane to engage in murder. A robbery gone wrong, unintentional killing, insanity, road rage, that was 1994, sorry. Enemies in his mind, a traffic incident. The acne drug called Accutane, a work dispute, a stormy family relationship, mental illness, loneliness and depression, an animus towards women, an arranged marriage that didn't go well. These are the explanations that time and again the authorities offer. They avoid mention Islam. Now, on the general level, looking at what the problem is, politicians will not talk about Islam, Islamism, Muslims, Islamists, Mujahideen, and Jihadis. They'll talk about evildoers, militants, radical extremists, terrorists, and al-Qaeda operatives. They obscure the Islamic reality under fogs of verbiage. So, George W. Bush spoke of the great struggle against extremism that is now playing out against the broader Middle East. Barack Obama said, we have a battle or a war against some terrorist organizations, but those organizations aren't representative of a broader Muslim community. There's some exceptions to this. Here's Tony Blair shortly after 7/7. This is a war, but a completely unconventional kind of war. It is in part a struggle between what I call reactionary Islam and moderate mainstream Islam, but its implications go far wider. That's the exception. It does happen from time to time. The trouble is that when an official like Blair gives a speech like this, it has no further implications. It's a good speech, but it doesn't actually have bearing on the way in which his government acts. Here's the foreign minister of the Czech Republic, Alexander Vondra, who speaks his mind with remarkable frankness. Radical Islamists challenge practically everything that our society claims to stand for, no matter what the Western policies were or are. These challenges include the concept of universal human rights and freedom of speech. That's saying it as it is. That's very unusual. Now, why? This is the heart of what I'd like to convey. Why? Why this denial of the role of Islam and Islamism in terrorism? The temptation is to say this is a result of euphemism, of cowardice, of political correctness, and of appeasement. In other words, avoiding trouble. But I don't think, while those certainly have a role here and there, I don't think those are the key factors. I think there's something more interesting and more basic taking place here. And I come to this conclusion because I look at specialists on counterterrorism, indeed on Islamist counterterrorism, and these are people who know full well, who've written PhD theses or books, and yet in their public capacities, they are not willing to talk about these subjects. So why? I think there are two things that are most important. One is a desire not to alienate Muslims, and two, a desire not to reorder society. Now, the one that's most often mentioned is a desire not to offend Muslims. This is a sincere and reasonable goal, one that I respect. There is a sense that if you talk about Islam, Muslims will hear it as a war on Islam. Here is the current State Department coordinator for counterterrorism, Daniel Benjamin, speaking exactly on this subject. Quote, putting the emphasis on Islamist instead of violent extremist undercuts our efforts since it falsely roots the core problem in the faith of more than 1 billion people who abhor violence. As one internal government study after another has shown, such statements invariably wind up being distorted in the global media, alienating Muslim moderates, unquote. So here's the explanation. You don't want to irritate Muslims. Now, as I say, I respect this, and I also wish not to irritate Muslims who are moderate. And I acknowledge that the frank discussion of Islam can have negative consequences. Still, I reject this approach. On a practical level, it's not clear how much harm is done in speaking about Islam. True anti-Islamist Muslims are not going to be bothered by this. Indeed, they want to talk about this. And there's little evidence to point to Muslims being radicalized by discussion of Islamism. Indeed, this is what Shiraz Maher was alluding to an hour or two ago, that there is no reason to appease. Let us talk about these issues frankly. If it is true that there are costs in talking about Islam, I would argue, let's grant that there are costs. I would argue that not mentioning this has even greater costs. That is to say, the need to define the enemy, not just within the councils of war privately, but for the public, trumps all other considerations. Just as a medical doctor must identify and name a disease before treating it, so must politicians and generals identify and name the enemy in order to defeat it. If one censors oneself, one gratuitously limits one's own ability to wage war. Avoiding mention of the enemy's identity sows confusion, harms morale, and squanders efforts. Indeed, the annals of history record no war won under circumstances in which the enemy's very name and identity may not be uttered. if you cannot name the enemy, you cannot defeat the enemy. So issue one, the reason one, is you don't want to disturb Muslim sensibilities. Reason two is you don't want to change the existing political and social order. This is not generally talked about, but I think this is no less important. If one talks uninhibitedly about Islam as a factor in terrorism and other forms of violence, this implies a large and undesirable shift away from the order that Western societies now have. Blaming terrorist attacks on drugs gone awry, road rage, Accutane, arranged marriages, mental cases, freak industrial accidents, and the like, means that you don't have to confront these issues connected to Islam. If the jihad explanation is overwhelmingly more persuasive, it's also far more awkward. It has implications that nobody really wants to deal with. If you're going to talk about Islamist terrorism, then you are talking about a form of terrorism that is almost exclusively perpetrated by Muslims. And then you're pointing to one element in the population, in the West, this is a small part of the population, 1%, 5%, that you're going to focus on. And you're going to single it out for special scrutiny. And that is problematic. Here's something I wrote in 2003 suggesting that such a thing is a desirable policy. And I prefaced it by saying that this is not something I like saying, it's not something you like hearing, but if we're going to be serious about security, this is what we have to do. There's no escaping the unfortunate fact that Muslim government employees and law enforcement, the military and the diplomatic corps need to be watched for connections to terrorism, as do Muslim chaplains in prisons and in the armed forces. Muslim visitors and immigrants must undergo additional background checks. Mosques require scrutiny beyond that applied to churches and temples, unquote. Now, this flies in the face of liberal, multicultural, and politically correct values. It also will be portrayed as illegal and even as unconstitutional. It means distinguishing on the base of a person's group characteristics. It involves profiling. These have so many unsettling implications. They will certainly be called Islamophobic and racist and so forth. And therefore, the police, the prosecutors, the politicians, and the professors avoid the actual factors behind Islamic terrorism and pretend that one-off incidents concerning this or that problem are in fact the causation. These soothing and accurate excuses have the advantage of implying no changes other than vigilance against weapons. Now, that is, I think, the core of the problem. One, a wish not to offend Muslims. Two, a wish not to reorder society in unpleasant ways. Will this always be the case? I don't think so. The very fact that our counterterrorism is impeded by these considerations means that terrorism is more likely. And as others have pointed out, the terrorism we've had is perhaps minor in its implication, in its violence compared to what might come. Let's put it this way. 3,000 people is the largest terrorist toll so far, and it didn't really have that much impact. Certainly not in what I'm talking about. With 30,000? Maybe. I doubt it. 300,000? Probably. 3 million? No doubt. 3 million Westerners were killed. Today's worries would fade, and there'd be determination to protect lives. And Muslim sensibilities and the need to reorder society would be just done, like that. And Israel is the control case. Israel is the country which is under the most severe threats, and it is the most impatient with pieties. And to give one example, leaving the country is a very different process, or going on a plane in this country is a very different process in Israel than from any other Western state. There is not a focus on weapons, there's a focus on who you are and why you're traveling. That is the bitter lesson Israelis have learned. They can't fool around. They can't go easy in these matters. I fear that such will be the case in other countries as mass murder takes place. In other words, our tactics in fighting terrorism depend on the competence and the brutality of our enemy. If our enemy doesn't manage to kill a lot of people, we will be able to go along with what some call security theater. If they do manage, we will get serious. So effective counterterrorism depends on terrorist activity, not on us. Now, what is there to do for those of us who are concerned about this, who note that Islamism, Muslims, Islamists, jihad are part of the equation? I would say two things. First, we must intellectually prepare for calamity. In other words, should there be hundreds of thousands or millions dead, we need to be there with a program that is fair, that is fully elaborated, that is careful, and that treats Muslims correctly, unlike what could happen in a moment of rage. It's important to work this out in advance. And secondly, I think it's important to argue with those who hold this position that you don't want to talk about Islam. I think it needs to be done not by hitting them over the head and telling them what fools they are, but by appreciating the validity of their concerns. We don't really want to rile Muslim sensibilities. We don't really want to change the political order. None of us do. So one has to respect that and say, fine, you've got a point, but it's not a convincing point. That there are consequences from holding to this approach that are potentially lethal, and therefore, in a time of relative calm like now, it should be rethought. In brief, even without expectation of winning a fundamental change in policy and talking about the real motivations of terrorism, I think much work remains to be done. Thank you.